scroll of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk, spelled Ket, Beit, Kof, Wa, Kof. And we're going to look at all of the book of Habakkuk, chapters 1 through 3. Habakkuk, I should say. In his scroll, Habakkuk questions Yahweh's judgments, to which Yahweh replies, foretelling woe to the wicked. And the prophet then offers prayers and a psalm to Yahweh in giving thanks. This is the chart we've shown before, showing the kings and the prophets of the house of Judah. Habakkuk prophesied the word of Yahweh prior to the Babylonian captivity of Judea. And so it is plausible that he spoke in the time of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Nineveh, which was in the year 612 in the 7th century BCE. And you can see on the chart there's a circle around a box with the capital H. That stands for Habakkuk. About the same time as contemporary of Jeremiah and Nahum and Zephaniah. To the right is a large circle encompassing 5 kings of Judea, starting with Yoshia and then Yahoakim. And the one below that does say Yahoakim, but it's misspelled. It should have an N, a noon on the end of that. It's Yahoakim. And finally, the last king of Judah, Zedekiah. As we'll discover, it was only Yoshia who was the righteous king. All the others were wicked kings, which eventually led to conquest by Babylon. So the time of Habakkuk was after the time that the Assyrians conquered Nineveh, and before they conquered Jerusalem, which was in the year 587, in the 6th century BCE. The last righteous king, Yoshua, ruled from 640 to 609 BC, and if you go back to the chart, you can see how it fits, how his prophecies were during that time, beginning in that time, but then went on into the other kings of Judah. The fate of Judea following Yoshua's death is contained in the final chapters of the books of Kings and Chronicles, when the people of Judea were taken into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And I just want to show a few of those verses. We're looking at 2 Chronicles, chapter 36, verses 1 through 4, for a picture that's also, same words are included in 2 Kings 23, verses 31 to 33. And it reads, "Then the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Yoshia, and made him king in his father's place in Jerusalem." And of course, this is in reference to Yoshua's death. Verse 2, Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. Now the king of Egypt deposed him at Jerusalem, kind of waiting, I suppose, for Yoshua's death, and coming in right after, on the tail of his death, to depose Jehoahaz. Now the king of Egypt deposed him at Jerusalem, and he imposed on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Then the king of Egypt made Jehoahaz's brother Eliakim. We were just reading about the name of Eliakim in the book of Isaiah. He made Jehoahaz's brother Eliakim king over Judah and Jerusalem by the king of Egypt, who changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. And Necho, the king of Egypt, carried Jehoshaphat, his brother, and carried him off to Egypt. So Yahshua was the last righteous king of Judah. Eliakim, alias Jehoiakim, was replaced by his son, Jehoiachin, with an N, a nun on the end, who did evil also, who was then replaced by another brother named Zedekiah, not the prophet Zedekiah, but the brother of Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim. Another evil king who refused to hear the word of Yahweh through the prophet Jeremiah, through Jeremiah. Like I say, Habakkuk was a contemporary of Jeremiah, and this last king of Judah refused to hear the words of Jeremiah as well. Then came the fall of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. Habakkuk chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. Verses 2 to 4. O Yahweh, he writes, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity? He's speaking of the iniquity in the land of Judah. And cause me to see trouble. For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore, and because of this, the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. And following that is Yahweh's reply to Habakkuk. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told to you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, and that word there, Chaldeans, in Hebrew is HaKasdim, otherwise known as the Babylonians, which in Hebrew is Babel B'nai, or B'nai Babel, as we might say it, which is, Babel B'nai means the house of confusion. A bitter and hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. Verses 7 and 8. And this sounds like Yahweh continuing to speak to Habakkuk. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses also are swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. Verses 9 through 11. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes, and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. Habakkuk then continues his anxiety-filled prayer to Yahweh, saying in verses 12 to 14, Are you not from everlasting, O Yahweh, my Elohim, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Yahweh. You have appointed them, speaking of those of Babylon, you have appointed them for judgment, O Rock. And in Hebrew, the word rock there is the Hebrew word tsur, spelled tzadik, wa, and resh. Tsur, meaning meaning to besiege, but it also can mean a fortification made of stone. From the same root that's used for the city, commonly pronounced Tyre, but it's actually pronounced Tsur. So the rock here is a fortification. It's also speaks of one who can besiege another nation. And Habakkuk continues, "You have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why," he asks, "do you look on those who deal treacherously, and cannot look on and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them?" Again, he's looking at the land of Judea there, the house of Judah, looking at all the wickedness of the people and of the kings as well. And he writes in verses 15 to 17, they take up all of them with a hook. Speaking of Babylon taking up the people of Judah. They catch them in their net and gather them in their dragnet. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice to their net. They worship the net. And burn incense to their dragnet, because by them their share is sumptuous and their food plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? So here Habakkuk is describing those who worship the creation and not the Creator. And second chapter of Habakkuk, beginning in verse 1, where he declares, "I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected." Verses 2 and 3. "Then Yahweh answered me and said, Write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time." Okay, and those two words in English, appointed time, is one word in Hebrew. It's the word moed, which is likely a reference to a holy convocation. And I'm thinking that it's one of the feast days after Yahshua returns, the Day of Trumpet, Atonement, Tabernacles, and the 8th day. One of those Yahweh is speaking of when he says the vision is yet for an appointed time. Then he goes on, "But at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries," these are the words that Habakkuk is to write, "though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry." Verse 4, "Behold the proud. His soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith." And in all of what we have just read, faith is action. It's doing what Yahweh requires us to do. It's being obedient to his word. Otherwise, he is going to come against those who are against his word, who openly sin and transgress his instructions. Verses 5 and 6. "Indeed, because he transgresses by wine, he is a proud man, and he does not stay at home. Because he enlarges his desire as hell." That's the English translation for the word Sheol, which means the grave. "And he is like death." And the word death there is not the word Sheol, but it's the Hebrew word mawet, which simply just means death, and cannot be satisfied. And this is a reference to, I believe, Proverbs 30, verse 16, in reference to the four things that never say enough. The grave is one of those things that never says enough. And he goes on, "He gathers to himself all nations and heaps up for himself all peoples." He's speaking again about Babylon. "Will not all these take up a proverb against him?" The nations that they've captured. "And a taunting riddle against him, and say, Woe to him who increases what is not his. How long?" And the implication seems to be, how long must we wait? Which Habakkuk seems to be implying. And to him who loads himself with many pledges or with debts. Habakkuk continues his rant against Babylon in verses 7 and 8, which reads, "Will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Will they not awaken who oppress you, and you will become their booty? Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and the city and of all who dwell in it." Habakkuk seems to be implying that it's the people who are going to raise in rebellion against Babylon. We all know that this has got to be by the hands of Yahweh. Verses 9 through 11. "Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disasters. You give shameful counsel to your house, cutting off many peoples, and sin against your soul. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it." And the picture I have in my mind when I read that is that the houses will collapse upon the leaders of Babylon. Verses 12 to 14. "Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed, who establishes a city by iniquity." And in reading that, the vision of many nations going out over the world, even today, we see people creating cities, overtaking cities by shedding blood. Millions of people have been killed in the name of religion as justification for man's bid for power and control. Verse 13, "Behold, is it not of Yahweh of hosts that the peoples labor to feed the fire, and nations weary themselves in vain? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh, as the waters cover the sea." So he's given the picture that it is Yahweh who's going to cover the nations, not other nations who have been conquered by Babylon. Verses 15 and 16. "Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to your bottle, even make him drunk, that you may see his nakedness." And the word nakedness there is the Hebrew word kalon. Kalon, meaning shame. And then it goes on in verse 16, "You are filled with shame," which is again the word kalon, "instead of glory. You also drink," and that word there, drink, is a command, meaning to die, as Yahshua himself partook of the cup referenced in Matthew 20, verse 22. Drink, in other words, die. "And be exposed as uncircumcised." And this is yet another command. It's revealing one's unrighteousness and disobedience, to be uncircumcised in heart as well as the flesh. And then he writes, "The cup of Yahweh's right hand will be turned against you, and utter shame will be on your glory." Who is that? And what is the cup of Yahweh's right hand? Could the cup of Yahweh's right hand be a reference to the cup of the new covenant and Yahshua's blood? Prophesied in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, who was, Jeremiah was a contemporary of Habakkuk, which verses are also repeated from Jeremiah in verses 7 through 13 in Hebrews chapter 8. The exact words are repeated there, in which the law of Yahweh will be placed into the hearts and minds of the called out ones. Could this be the cup that Habakkuk is referencing here? Certainly this is an end time prophecy that he is revealing. Verse 17, "For the violence done to Lebanon will cover you, and the plunder of beast which made them afraid, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and the city, and all who dwell in it. 18 and 19. What profit is the image that its maker, it's talking about an idol, that its maker should carve the molded image, a teacher of lies, that the maker of its mold should trust in it to make mute idols? Woe to him who says to wood, awake! To silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. And the word breath there is the word ruach. There is no spirit in that at all. Verse 20, but Yahweh is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Wow. Hallelujah to that. In chapter 3, beginning with verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigonath. Now, looking up what that word is, it's capitalized, and but at least in the English translation, but at its root, the meaning of Shigonath is south. And some scholars report this name as unknown, or the origin of that name unknown, but others say this is a reference to Mount Sinai, as the next verse implies. In verse 2, which we read as, O Yahweh, I have heard your speech and was afraid. When did Israel hear the voice of Yahweh, which is actually the voice of Yahshua, and was afraid? Well, it was at Mount Sinai. And it goes on, O Yahweh, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Verses 3 to 5. Elohim came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. And these are more references to Mount Sinai. And then the word Selah, which means to pause or to meditate. And then he writes, his glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. These pretty much describe events that happened after Israel left Mount Sinai and spent 40 years in the wilderness. Habakkuk continues to expand upon the history of Israel in the following verses, verses 6 to 7. He writes, he stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. Again, this conjures up the vision of Israel finally crossing the Jordan and into the Promised Land and destroying governments and destroying the peoples that were basically against Yahweh. 8 and 9. O Yahweh, were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea, that you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. Selah. You divided the earth with rivers. Verses 10 and 11. The mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went, at the shining of your glittering spear. 12 and 13. You marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from foundation to neck. Selah. Contemplate that. 14 and 15. You thrust through with your own arrows the head of his villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. You walked through the sea with your horses through the heap of great waters. I picture Moses leading Israel through the Red Sea. Not exactly chronologically, but verse 16, when I heard, my body trembled, my lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. And when he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. And finally, Habakkuk waxes poetic. In verses 17 and 18, he writes, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in Yahweh. I will joy. And typically we see that word joy as a noun, but here it's a verb, and it's the Hebrew word giel, which means to spin around. I will spin around in joy, rejoicing, in the Elohim of my salvation. Verse 19, Yahweh Elohim is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high heels. I'm sorry, let me read that again. And he will make me walk on my high hills. And then he's writing this psalm to the chief musician with my stringed instruments. Habakkuk reveals the word of Yahweh, and he also reveals his anxiety in his vision of the destruction of Judah by Babylon. However, in the end, the prophet speaks and acts in behalf of Yahweh's mercy and his eventual salvation that he will bring to all the followers and believers in Yahweh, the followers of Yahshua. Hallelujah.